During the Great Depression, grocery shelves went bare, and millions faced hunger. Yet ordinary families did not just survive. They grew strange, forgotten crops that kept them alive. Some were roots the size of footballs. Others were weeds turned into dinner. Today, most of us have never even heard of them. With food prices rising and supply chains stretched thin, these abandoned, life-saving crops might be worth another look. Stay tuned, because you are about to discover 20 vegetables that saved our grandparents when the world was falling apart. Jerusalem artichokes. Jerusalem artichokes, often called sunchokes, were a Depression-era staple because they grew where little else would. Their knobby roots thrived in poor soil, spread quickly, and provided a steady food source that could be harvested well into the winter. Families cooked them like potatoes, boiling or roasting them for a nutty, slightly sweet flavor. They were also eaten raw, sliced thin for salads, or added to relishes. These artichokes stored well when kept in cool soil, meaning families could dig them up as needed instead of worrying about spoilage. Their resilience made them a quiet hero in backyard gardens. Although overlooked today, Jerusalem artichokes once held a valued place on the table when fresh produce was scarce and every calorie counted. Rutabaga. During the Great Depression, rutabagas were known as the poor man's potato. They were cheap to grow, easy to harvest, and hardy enough to survive cold winters. Families leaned on this humble root when more familiar staples were scarce. Its golden flesh had a sweet, earthy flavor that worked well in soups, stews, and simple roasted dishes. Many grandparents recalled boiling rutabagas with a touch of salt or mashing them alongside potatoes to stretch meals further. While not glamorous, this crop filled bellies when little else was available. Generations later, it has quietly slipped from most gardens. Yet in those difficult years, rutabaga was a dependable friend, a reminder that survival often came from the simplest foods pulled from the soil. Dandelion. The dandelion is often dismissed as a weed today, but during the Great Depression, families saw it as a reliable garden crop. Cultivated dandelion varieties provided tender greens that were packed with vitamins and minerals at a time when fresh produce was scarce. Leaves were gathered early in the season when they were mild, then boiled, sautéed, or added to soups. Older, more bitter leaves were still eaten, often mixed with other greens to balance the flavor. Dandelion roots were also used, roasted as a coffee substitute, or dried for medicinal teas. Families appreciated how easily it grew, returning year after year without much effort. What some considered a nuisance was, in truth, a life-saving source of nutrition that could be counted on. Mangelwurzel. Mangelwurzel, sometimes called the giant beet, was another Depression-era lifesaver. Originally grown as animal fodder, its enormous roots could weigh several pounds and offered a reliable source of both food and feed. Families discovered it could be roasted, boiled, or even grated into hearty soups. The leaves were edible too, providing much-needed greens in lean seasons. Grandparents spoke of cellars filled with these massive roots stored away for the long winters when fresh produce was hard to find. Though it may sound unusual today, Mangelwurzel was a crop that meant security. And in hard times, security was priceless. This forgotten giant once stood as proof that even the most unassuming vegetables could carry families through hunger and hardship with strength and resilience. American Groundnut. The American groundnut was a quiet hero of the Great Depression, though many people today have never heard of it. This perennial vine produced clusters of edible tubers underground, each one rich in protein and calories. Families harvested them in the fall, cooking the nutty potato-like roots by boiling, roasting, or slicing them into stews. In some regions, the beans that grew along the vine were eaten as well, making this plant a rare double source of food. Unlike many crops, groundnuts returned year after year with little care, which meant, once planted, they could keep producing without much extra work. Families relied on them as a hidden safety net in their gardens. For households that needed every ounce of nutrition, the American groundnut offered both resilience and sustenance when it mattered most. Salsify. Salsify was often called the oyster plant, not because it came from the sea, but because its cooked flavor carried a faint oyster-like taste. During the Depression, it became a small but meaningful crop in family gardens. Its thin white roots were simmered in soups, sautéed with butter, or mashed like parsnips. Grandparents knew it was not a crop to impress neighbors, but it added variety and nutrition when diets became monotonous. Salsify was also hardy, surviving cool seasons and providing food later in the year when other vegetables were long gone. Though it has almost disappeared from markets today, for families in the 1930s, Salsify represented resourcefulness, turning even unusual roots into meals that nourished and comforted in uncertain times. Ground cherries. Ground cherries brought a little sweetness to otherwise plain Depression-era diets. These small golden fruits grew inside papery husks, resembling miniature lanterns. They thrived in poor soils and were easy to grow, often reseeding themselves year after year. Families treasured them for their versatility. They were eaten fresh as a snack, baked into pies and cobblers, or made into jams that brightened the pantry shelves. Ground cherries also stored well inside their husks for weeks, giving families a rare taste of fruit long after harvest. They were especially popular with children who loved peeling back the husks to reveal the hidden berry inside. Though often forgotten today, ground cherries were a dependable source of flavor and nutrition, adding cheer and variety to meals during difficult times. Winter radishes. Winter radishes were larger and heartier than the small salad radishes most people know today. They grew quickly, stored well, and added spice to otherwise plain meals. During the Great Depression, families relied on them for their ability to stay fresh in root cellars long after harvest. Black Spanish and China rose varieties were common, both capable of lasting through the cold months without losing flavor. Radishes were grated into slaws, cooked in stews, or simply sliced with a bit of salt. Their peppery bite brightened meals that might have otherwise been dull. Easy to plant and dependable in yield, winter radishes were an essential part of a survival garden. They kept meals lively when food choices were severely limited. Hamburg-rooted parsley. Hamburg-rooted parsley was not the garnish type of parsley we think of today, but a vegetable in its own right. Its long white roots were similar to parsnips and were boiled, roasted, or added to soups for a mild, earthy flavor. Depression-era families loved it because they could also use the leaves for seasoning, making the plant serve two purposes at once. In an age where every square foot of garden counted, that mattered. Hamburg parsley grew well in cooler weather and stored easily in root cellars, providing fresh food in the leanest months. It may not have been flashy, but it was reliable, versatile, and practical. For families needing to stretch meals further with little money to spend, Hamburg parsley was a vegetable that truly pulled its weight. Parsnips. Parsnips were a familiar root vegetable to grandparents of the Depression era, valued for their sweetness that deepened after frost. Families grew them alongside carrots and potatoes, knowing they would hold up well in cold storage and provide fresh food through the winter months. Parsnips were often roasted, mashed, or sliced into soups and stews, where their mild, nutty flavor added warmth and substance. Some families even used them in pies or cakes, stretching scarce sugar with the vegetable's natural sweetness. Easy to grow and able to survive freezing weather, parsnips became a reliable staple. They were practical, versatile, and hardy enough to see families through lean times when gardens had to provide nearly everything. Kentucky Wonder Pole beans. Kentucky Wonder pole beans were among the most dependable vegetables our grandparents planted during the Depression years. Unlike bush beans, these vigorous vines climbed high and kept producing throughout the season, giving families a steady supply of food from a small patch of soil. The pods were long and stringy, but when picked young, they were tender and flavorful, perfect for boiling, stewing, or canning. Older pods were often shelled and used as dry beans, making the plant useful in more than one way. Families liked that they could harvest again and again, especially since fresh vegetables were so hard to come by in the winter months. Their tall vines also added a little beauty to gardens, climbing fences and poles while quietly helping to keep hunger away. Kentucky Wonder pole beans truly lived up to their name for Depression-era households. Collard greens. Collard greens were one of the toughest crops grandparents grew during the Great Depression. They thrived in poor soils, resisted frost, and produced fresh leaves long after many other vegetables had withered. Families valued them because they could be harvested continuously, picking leaf after leaf as needed. In the kitchen, collards were usually boiled slowly, sometimes with salt pork or ham bones, to soften their sturdy leaves into rich, comforting meals. They were rich in vitamins and minerals, making them an important balance to diets heavy in starches. Their durability meant they could be counted on when more fragile crops failed. Collard greens were not just food, they were a steady supply of nourishment that could be relied upon throughout the year. Skirret. Skirret was a root vegetable that our grandparents grew, but it has nearly disappeared from gardens today. This old-world crop produced clusters of thin, sweet white roots that tasted somewhere between carrot and parsnip. During the Great Depression, families valued skirret because it was perennial, meaning once planted, it could provide food for years with very little care. The roots were boiled, roasted, or stewed, and their natural sweetness made them a welcome change from plainer staples like turnips or rutabagas. Skirret was also highly adaptable, growing well in damp soils where other crops often failed. Its ability to produce reliable food with minimal work made it a practical choice for struggling families. Though forgotten in most modern kitchens, skirret quietly carried its weight when survival depended on the garden. Swiss chard. Swiss chard was another Depression-era garden hero, prized for both its beauty and practicality. With colorful stems and large leafy greens, it was not only eye-catching, but also productive. Families grew it because it yielded continuously through the season, and both the stems and leaves were edible. The greens were often sautéed or boiled, while the crunchy stems could be chopped and cooked like celery. Unlike delicate spinach, Swiss chard could withstand heat and still provide a steady harvest, making it especially valuable in warmer climates. It was easy to grow, took little space, and added important nutrients to daily meals. Grandparents leaned on Swiss chard to stretch their gardens further, knowing it would deliver dependable harvests even under tough conditions. Field peas. Field peas may not have been glamorous, but they were essential for survival during the Great Depression. Hardy and drought-resistant, they thrived in poor soils where many other crops failed. Families grew them because they provided both food and soil improvement. The peas themselves were eaten fresh or dried for long-term storage, while the vines enriched the ground with nitrogen, preparing it for future crops. In the kitchen, field peas were boiled with bits of salt pork or simply seasoned with onions to create hearty meals. They were filling, packed with protein, and inexpensive to grow in large quantities. Families across the South especially relied on them, often making a pot of peas the centerpiece of dinner. For gardens that needed to provide both food and fertility, field peas were truly indispensable. Winter cabbage. Winter cabbage, particularly the Danish ballhead variety, was a staple in survival gardens during the Great Depression. This hardy cabbage produced dense, compact heads that stored exceptionally well, sometimes lasting months in root cellars without spoiling. Families planted it because it could be grown in cool weather and harvested late, ensuring fresh produce deep into winter. In the kitchen, it was versatile. Shredded for slaws, simmered into soups, or fermented into sauerkraut, which extended its shelf life even further. Cabbage was filling, nutritious, and reliable, a combination that made it vital for families living with limited resources. The Danish baldhead variety earned its reputation as a dependable crop that could be trusted to provide steady food when it was needed most. Runner beans. Runner beans were another crop that played an important role in Depression-era gardens, not only for their food value, but also for their hardiness and ornamental beauty. With scarlet flowers climbing up trellises, they brightened homesteads while quietly providing reliable harvests. Families cooked the young pods as snap beans, but they also saved the mature beans to dry and store for winter use. This dual purpose made them highly practical when resources were limited. Runner beans thrived in cooler weather, allowing families in northern regions to depend on them when heat-loving crops struggled. They were often planted alongside corn or fences, maximizing garden space. Easy to grow, attractive, and highly productive, runner beans gave families both beauty and sustenance at a time when every plant had to earn its place in the garden. Navy beans. Navy beans were a true backbone of survival during the Great Depression. Known for their small, creamy white seeds, they were inexpensive to grow, dried well for storage, and packed with protein. Families relied on them to stretch meals further, often making bean soups, baked beans, or hearty stews that could feed large households. Navy beans stored for months in jars or sacks without spoiling, which made them dependable when fresh food was unavailable. They were also versatile, pairing well with pork, onions, or just a little salt to create filling, nourishing meals. Simple, affordable, and reliable, navy beans were one of the most practical crops for struggling families. They offered both nutrition and security in times when every calorie mattered. Sea kale. Sea kale was another Depression-era crop that blended resilience with practicality. Families grew it for its large bluish-green leaves and thick shoots, which could be blanched and eaten like asparagus. It thrived in poor, sandy soils near the coast, but also adapted inland, making it versatile for different regions. Grandparents appreciated how it came back year after year once established, sparing them from replanting. The shoots were steamed or boiled, while the leaves were cooked like collards, offering variety in otherwise limited diets. Sea kale was especially valuable because it grew early in spring, providing fresh greens when little else was available. Its perennial nature, hardiness, and usefulness in the kitchen made it a true Depression garden staple. Though rare today, it was once essential for both nourishment and survival. Lamb's quarters. Lamb's quarters, sometimes called wild spinach, were another plant many grandparents turned to when gardens had to stretch further. This hardy green popped up easily in poor soil and often required no attention at all. Its tender young leaves were harvested and cooked just like spinach, either boiled, creamed, or added to soups and stews. Older leaves could be tougher, but they still provided valuable nutrition when food was limited. Lamb's quarters were rich in vitamins, minerals, and protein, making them especially important when diets were short on variety. Families often foraged them in fields or along fence lines, grateful for a plant that nature provided freely. Though forgotten in modern kitchens, lamb's quarters played a crucial role in keeping meals wholesome. Our grandparents leaned on these forgotten crops to survive the hardest years of the Depression, and many of them could still help us today. Which of these would you consider growing in your own garden? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more timeless garden wisdom. See you in the next video.